I'm an English teacher, not fucking Tomb Raider. This is a No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. And we are in episode 5 of season 8, the last episode in our series that we just might not ever escape from. We're talking all about trapped horror.
Well, like Lisa said in that intro, we are continuing our exploration of trapped horror. Just want to give a shout out to that quote at the beginning of the episode. It was, if you did not recognize it, it was from the movie The Descent, which I'm sure we're going to be talking a decent amount about this episode because we're focusing this time on trapped in nature as our trapped focus for the episode. So we do have some other ones, but I'm sure for a lot of you, if I say the phrase trapped in nature, The Descent, or possibly maybe 127 hours because that's a newer film, those are probably the two that jump to the forefront. They're the ones that jump to the forefront for my mind. And I guess one thing that I think is different about this in terms of the other trapped things that we've discussed so far in this series is that, I mean, nature itself, there doesn't need to be anything supernatural or weird or anything. There's a lot of things out there that can just plain kill you. And I say this as somebody who grew up in a city, maybe not the largest of cities, but I definitely grew up in like suburban areas. And I'm not a huge camper, if you hadn't gathered that. I do like going out in the woods. I like being in nature, but it's I mean, I found too many black widows around my house, like in the backyard under things, to be comfortable going like and spending long periods in the woods, if that makes sense. So for me, trapped in nature is a very scary thing because I think like a lot of people, not just my age, but in this era, I mean, it's 2023, most of us don't have a lot of survival skills and know-how unless you were in the Boy Scouts or raised by somebody who was like a doomsday prepper. You probably don't. You probably wouldn't survive if you were literally trapped in the woods, or it would be very difficult. I would not know what plants are edible and which aren't. I mean, I'd have an idea if it was something I'd seen before, but I mean, there's plenty out there that are poisonous that are not brightly marked and brightly colored that I might accidentally ingest. So for me, yeah, I think this is quite possibly the scariest of the trapped ones because I mean I could be trapped in a workplace and I mean I've been doing that for years. I don't always like it, but it's something. But being trapped out in nature, it's like I feel like I just don't have the skills to survive, even if it was completely non-supernatural, I guess. So, I guess I'm gonna kind of kick it over to Mel or Lisa too. Like, what about being trapped in nature do you find like the horror in? I mean, do you feel the same as me, or do you find some other places for horror?
You know, it's really funny though listening to you describe it because I am a firm like city dweller. I mean, I enjoy like the occasional like walk outside in nature. I'm not an avid like hiker or anything. The idea of camping outside does not appeal to me at all. You know, yeah, I'm like you. I'm like, there's too many things that could kill me, and I'm not prepared for it. Uh, I just, I know I would not survive very long in that scenario. Um, but it's funny because there is something very like it is a different type of horror. I think when you're talking about survival and nature type horror, because last episode we talked about like workplace and suburban horror, and we specifically talked a lot about the movie the TV show Severance, which is one of my favorite shows right now. But that evokes in me this kind of existential dread that is a type of horror that I think you can feel, like a type of fright, but it's very different from what we're talking about today. Existential dread is something that kind of like creeps up on you, and I also feel like it's something that you can live with. Like as humans, we're sort of built to live in that kind of existential dread. Like, it kind of creeps up on you. You might ruminate on it a little bit, but then it can kind of go, you can distract yourself from it. A lot of us are in that kind of, as you said, Matt, that kind of like workplace horror of being trapped in the mundane office every day. And a lot of us live in the suburbs. A lot of us have that kind of, we can recognize the weirdness about it, but still live there. This is something like completely different because I don't have claustrophobia. Being in small spaces normally does not bother me. However, I went down into a cave one time. This was not like a descent situation, but it was, I think it was visiting Mammoth Caves actually in Kentucky. And you walk down, at least the one I visited, the cave I visited, you kind of walk down these stairs, which right away, it was these rickety, like very narrow stairs. And you're just going down, 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 down. It was a tiny little door, like at the top, going into the actual cave. And then you just keep walking down. Right then, I started panicking because I was just like, how far are we going to walk to get down there? Then we get down there and they're taking us around, and it is really beautiful. It's something like a part of nature that you like don't see. It's very awe-inspiring. But then they turn out the lights and to show you like how exactly like dark it is. I nearly went into a panic, like a full on, I need help to like calm myself down type of panic. I did not like it. There was something in me that immediately needed to get out of that cave. And by the time we got out, I remember just like, physically shaking, being like very upset. The friends who I was with at the time, I remember them being like, "Are you okay?" And then being like, that was really cool the way you kind of handled that because like it was clear that I was not okay. And they were like, "You held it together really well." And I was like, "Thanks, I think." But I don't know. It's something that touches that like primal part of me, that you realize how quickly, like how small you are, and just how unprepared you are for it. And Mel, I know I've talked to you about this before, so I'm really curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, we've actually had a discussion about the Mammoth Cave experience because I went on the same tour, not like with you. I was probably younger than you when I did this because it was a family vacation. I think I was probably in elementary school, maybe early middle school. But yeah, we went on that same tour where you're on those staircases, and it's cool and it's beautiful, and something that you don't often see, like you said. But then you get to that room where they turn the lights off, and it's hard to even imagine what it would be like if you haven't been in a situation where there's absolutely no light. And of course, at the time, like we didn't have cell phones or things like that. I mean, it's not like you could just pull your cell phone out and turn on your light and you're fine. And you just hold your hand in front of your face and you don't even like know you're doing it other than the fact that you moved your hand. And there is something, I think, I did not have like a panicked experience. I don't remember that, but I do remember like maybe a little bit of like, like a little bit of like my adrenaline going and getting a little nervous. And of course they turn the lights back on because they didn't leave them off for too long. Cause I guess they don't want people to, you know, freak out too much while you're in the cave. But yeah, I remember that vividly, that experience of just utter and complete darkness where you don't even know like where you are literally within it, and you can't see the edges, I guess, of where you end and everything is around you. And I guess too the horror of like if you were in that situation and not on a tour and something happened, you could easily like fall and get injured and never be seen again. And so for a person with anxiety, it's easy to start thinking about those sorts of things. So yeah, I mean, I don't think I necessarily have claustrophobia per se. Um, but that aspect, I think as humans, these are things that are primal fears that we have, being in tight spaces, being in the dark. And those things happen more often, I think, now in the 21st century and the 20th and 21st century in nature. There's something else I was thinking about, and this kind of plays off what you were saying, Matt. I also, like you guys, I'm not necessarily a big hiker. I've never camped. I don't know that I ever will. I don't hate nature. I like going into it. But I do very simple things. I'm not like trying to direct myself around. I want a trail that makes sense and I want some people with me and that sort of thing. But I've had a couple experiences like going hiking. I've gone on some trips with my sister in the past where we did short hikes and we're looking at things. And even when everything's controlled and there's other people around that you chat with while you're going, there are moments where you could fall and hurt yourself. Or, if you're on the side of a very high precipice or looking at a waterfall, you could fall in that situation. And you see signs or you see things online about how people have had these accidents. And so even something that we think of as like relatively close to a populated area and a very popular trail to look at a waterfall or something can still be dangerous. You wake up in the morning and you don't think something terrible is going to happen, and then some sort of accident happens. And I was looking at some of these movies, and we have that kind of idea, like people going out and doing things that they're trained for, or things that they think are going to be fun or easy, or something terrible isn't going to happen, and things take a turn for the worse because nature and the weather is unpredictable. And I also just wanted to say really quickly before I throw it back to y'all that another thing I thought a lot about when I was thinking about this is the idea of how it's very hard for us to be lost now. But when we are, I think that's terrifying in a way it wasn't before. Before cell phones, if I wanted to go, I drove like exploratory driving, like all over the place, like not having a phone or a person in my car telling me which way to turn. I would just go look around, see what I saw, and figure out my way back. And I feel like that's a skill that maybe I don't necessarily have or feel comfortable with anymore because I've gotten so used to the GPS telling me what to do. Like I used to just open up a map and familiarize myself with things around it so I could figure it out or do MapQuest or write down the directions I needed or stop and ask somebody. And you get like bewildered, but it's not like being lost in the wilderness. But I know several years ago, I set up my phone to tell me how to get from one place to another when I was living in West Virginia at the time. And halfway through my trip, I obviously like lost all signal. This is going to happen because I got in a very kind of rural area and it was very mountainy. And so I paused because I couldn't remember precisely where I needed to go. I looked ahead a little bit before I took off, but I just kind of like trusted that my phone would be with me the whole time. And I realized that my phone wasn't really doing anything anymore. And so I had to kind of, while I was paused, like think, okay, well, which direction do I need to go in so that I know that I'll eventually get somewhere where the phone will kick back on. And so I ended up going the right way. But I had this like really brief prick in the back of my mind, like, oh my gosh, I don't know precisely where I am now. And my phone isn't telling me where to go. And it made me realize that my thoughts about even that sort of thing, like driving from one place to another, has become so reliant on that I can't imagine if I was like out in the actual wilderness where I knew a GPS or a cell phone couldn't help me, um, and got bewildered. I feel like in the state that I'm in now, or the way that I think of how I, live my life, that would be jarring in a way that maybe it wouldn't have been pre cell phone, pre the technology that we have now, because I'm just not trained for those sorts of experiences.
Well, I absolutely agree with what you're saying there, Mel, about how I think cell phones in many ways have kind of made us less prepared for what would happen if we don't have them. I I think back to the time kind of before cell phones, and I was like you. I had maps in my car, and I tended to prepare more before I like left home than I do now because I have my phone. And even as Matt was talking at the very top of the episode about being out in the woods and not knowing what plants were okay to eat and which ones were not. And I thought, well, yeah, because you just like take a picture of it, and there are probably apps that you can upload in the, the picture to, and it will tell you like if it's okay to eat or not, or if it will cause a rash if you touch it. But um, inevitably, when you get trapped in nature, in each of these, I think, movies that we're going to be talking about either predate cell phones or, for whatever reason, usually it's because they're so isolated, or phones, the battery will eventually run down, that kind of thing, because there's no electricity, of course. There's no place to recharge your phone. And so I know my phone, for instance, would not last very long without a charge. It certainly wouldn't go 24 hours. So that doesn't give me much time to try to, call for help or use it in any way that could help me. But I know even driving through a city, there are places that I'll hit a dead spot and I'll drop whatever call I'm on. So yeah, I can't imagine it's very reliable. But I feel like since we've been talking about this, and since we did talk about the cave experience first, that maybe we should talk about some underground horror and some trapped underground. The first, now, listeners, I should probably put a couple of footnotes, I guess, to this episode. Number one, I know that there are a lot of trapped in nature movies and television shows, and books and stories. We're not going to talk about all of them. We kind of tried to pick our favorites and ones that we were familiar with, at least some of us. So keep that in mind. And we will be spoiling these. So if you hear us talking about something that you haven't seen but want to, maybe just, use your fast forward button on this. I don't know. But it seems like, at least to me, a logical place to start would be The Descent. This movie, if you're not familiar with it, it came out in 2005. It's a British horror film, and it's about a group of women who go on a caving expedition. Now, I will say that there is kind of a twist a little bit halfway through this um, movie, where they find out that there are these like creatures, humanoid creatures under the ground that end up attacking them. But even before that, I think this movie does a really good job at really exemplifying what we're talking about. So there are this group of friends, as I said, this group of girls who decide to go out spelunking. And they've done it before. They're all experienced at doing this. And they're in part of the Appalachian Mountain Range in, I think, North Carolina. The movie was filmed in England, but I think, well, throughout the United Kingdom, but it's supposed to take place in North Carolina. And it starts with them kind of going into this mountain cave entrance, where it's like it's basically like a hole in the ground that they descend into. And while they're in there, they keep kind of going through these passages that get like more narrow as they go. So right away, it hits on this kind of claustrophobia. But there's this really neat kind of narrative device, I think, that the movie uses, that they're going through all these narrow passageways. I think there's a collapse at one point, and so they can't go back the way they came in. And at that point, they realize that the main girl, who's been kind of leading them through this, has lied to them, and they're not in the cave system that they thought they were in. So there was a cave system that is pretty regularly explored and has been mapped out. And then they realize that they're in a different cave system, and not by accident either, that their friend led them there on purpose because she wants to explore something that's never been explored before, and she just didn't think that they would be on board with it. So it immediately kind of cuts off any possibility that like rescue might come, because everybody thinks they're in a different cave system. So right there, I think that you kind of have the panic from a lot of different angles. You've got the fact that they're trapped underground, the fact that they don't have a map, that they don't know where they are, and that the people that they've told, like, hey, FYI, I'm going spelunking, and if I don't come back, this is where I am. Everybody's going to be looking in the wrong place for them. So, and then of course you have like the implications of that, like the fact that their friend lied to them, and there's infighting and that kind of thing in the group. But it's a really, really intense movie. It's one of those that I watched in the theater and I had a hard time sitting through the whole thing because I was just on the edge of my seat. Um, and then, of course, then the creatures come after them. But Matt, I think you've seen this movie. What are your thoughts on The Descent?
I think you captured very, very closely how I feel about this movie. I am, generally speaking, not a fan of spelunking. It's I don't have panic attack inducing claustrophobia, but I definitely have enough claustrophobia that it makes me uncomfortable enough that that is just something that I'm not planning on doing. I do have a hard time like even watching it on screen sometimes because I'm just, you know, um, I get in my own head and think, oh my God, this is not cool. So I definitely, I feel like The Descent is, well, like I said at the top of the show, it's one of the first ones that came to mind when we said Trapped in Nature, because this has so many elements of things that would just make me fall apart if I were in this situation in real life. And my only complaint about the movie is that it did seem like it kind of fell off a bit in the third act. But I don't know. That seems to be kind of a common thing with a lot of horror movies, sadly. But like the first 2/3 of that movie, I was very uncomfortable and did not like it. Um, I mean, I kept watching it because that's what I came for. It was a horror movie, and it did its job very well. And I think what really got me the most was, like you said, that realization when they find out that, oh, this is not the cave system we were told it was, and that everyone else outside thinks we are in. We are in a completely different cave system that hasn't been explored. There is literally no help coming whatsoever, because even if help did come, because we haven't shown up in a few days, they'd be going to the wrong place. Like that moment, just sort of like I just felt like a sinking in my stomach. Like it was just an oh no. Um, I wasn't as big of a fan of the creatures, but I mean, they did a good job with it, I guess. I just felt like this movie could have done most of its horror without ever having to bring in something even. I wouldn't even call them supernatural. I mean, I guess they were kind of like another branch of evolution or something, because they evolved underground and couldn't see, and if I remember right, they used like echolocation to move around in the darkness and that kind of thing. Like it was interesting, and uh, but I mean the part that really got me with the horror was just them being trapped. Like for me, you don't even have to throw creatures into this cave. Them just getting lost in the cave alone is enough for me to go, this is pretty scary. But overall, I did like the movie. I did like it. I believe there was a sequel, which I have not seen, but yeah, like the I think The Descent pretty much epitomizes like when you say trapped in nature, I mean they are literally trapped in this cave system, and yeah, I don't think I've had any direct experiences like you or Mel in actual caves, because that is something that I try to avoid in general because I don't think I would handle it well.
This is slightly getting off the trap theme, but I wonder if the creatures in the movie were kind of a riff on all the strange folklore around caves as having goblins or otherworldly creatures, or like you said, Matt, like other people living in them. Because that's like a strain in like occult folklore in areas that have caves, as far as I know. I'm not deeply read in it, but I'm aware of it being from Kentucky and those caves. I wonder if it was a gesture to that, even though it kind of, like you're saying, dilutes what's going on between the women.
I could see that. I mean, we, like you said, there's folklore all through lots of different like caves and that sort of thing. There's also just that whole idea of the cave goes so deep that it actually, you know, unearths something almost inhuman. Um, if I recall correctly, that was a partial plot for that book, Meddling Kids, that was a riff on Scooby Doo, and as well as the first Lord of the Rings, where the dwarves dug so deep they unearthed the Balrog. but but yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, it's definitely within the realm of possibility. I don't want to infer um, any sort of, or attribute any sort of intention here on the screenwriters, but I could definitely see that being a riff on their, intentional or not. I could definitely get behind that interpretation.
I'm really surprised that there isn't more like Appalachian horror based around. I mean, there is in, I think, books more so than I've seen in movies, but yeah, I felt this could definitely be that. And I agree with you, Matt, about the third act and how I think they kind of added in some things in the screenplay that I don't know if it needed to be there in that last act. But and I haven't seen the sequel, so we can't recommend that. I do want to throw out as just kind of another little kind of a cave um, movie recommendation for trapped horror. And again, this one I think is kind of a cheat because it's not really nature; it's more man-made, and there is some supernatural. There's a lot of supernatural horror in this one, but is the movie As Above, So Below. Again, it's like The Descent. It's not um a perfect movie. It's not like something I'd put at the very tip top of any of my lists, but it is a good movie that delivers scares. So that if it tells you kind of it's a good movie. You know what I mean? It's not great. It's not perfect. It's not like this is a masterpiece, but it's good if you want that kind of trapped underground. In this particular case, it's about a group of filmmakers who go underground in the Paris catacombs. I'm pretty sure it's Paris. But anyway, they're in the catacombs, so then like under the city where people have buried their dead, and they go out to or they go underground to capture things on camera, and the things that they see are absolutely terrifying. And there's a sense very early on that they're not going to get out of this very easily. So I kind of want to throw that out there because, talking about The Descent and kind of this lost underground, I think As Above, So Below does it pretty well. So I'm just going to throw that out there. Um, as another recommendation. Um, as we're talking about trapped horror, Mel, you mentioned something while we were prepping for this episode that I know we've talked about a little bit, but that's The Birds, which I think does fit for this kind of trapped horror.
Yeah, I think The Birds worked really well, and I'm surprised I didn't think of it right away when we first started thinking of options for this. There are, and as you mentioned, Lisa, and we started talking about it before we hit record, there's a couple different ways that being trapped works. in the film that I hadn't even really thought of. I mean, my initial thought, and I was initially thinking of the 1963 Alfred Hitchcock movie that was based on Daphne du Maurier's 1952 short story. And this theme works in both of those, the story and the movie. But yeah, we've talked about the birds before on the podcast, and we've talked about it more in depth on the Monster She Wrote podcast. But the idea of being trapped by nature, I think, works really well. Typically, I think we think of the birds as like, we think we understand bird behavior through science, but we don't. The birds that start to act weirdly in the story, it's because of possible climate change. They've been pushed off their paths and they're not getting the food they need, and they're not in the right place at the right time of the season. In the movie, I don't think we ever get an explanation. They try to figure out, but they're so busy trying to survive. They don't have the time to try to figure out scientifically what's happening at that point. But yeah, because birds have turned against people and birds are outside and they can fly, your natural course of trying to protect yourself is to go inside. And so you end up with people kind of like turning their homes into bunkers to protect themselves from these attacking birds. And then all of that anxiety, especially toward the end of the movie when they're trapped in the house, is the idea of like everything they have to do to keep the birds from penetrating the windows, the doors, the chimney, etc. But then, like you pointed out, Lisa, before you hit record, you have the main character being trapped in a phone booth at one point, with the birds slinging themselves at the phone booth while she's inside of it. And later, she gets trapped in the attic when she goes to see what's going on there. Um, so I think, the idea of it's not necessarily being lost. I mean, they're in their own home. Well, most of the characters are familiar with the town. The main character is an outsider. But the idea is that something in nature is trying to get in and get you. I guess in some ways it's reminiscent of, we mentioned, I think Cujo in our first episode on Trapped Horror, that, idea of the animal or the nature kind of turning against people and they're trapped in the car. In a way, you have this with the birds. But Lisa, I know when we were chatting before we hit record, you said you felt like this maybe works better in the short story. I agree with you, but I wondered if you wanted to talk a bit about that, because I know you love du Maurier.
Yeah, I will use any chance I have to mention Daphne du Maurier to people because she's so, I think, closely aligned with Rebecca, and that most of the time when people are talking about her, they're talking about Rebecca. And she had a very uh, a long history of working with Hitchcock. She has a long history in horror and horror adaptations. I think a lot of people don't realize that The Birds was based on one of her stories. And I just will go out and say that I'm just, on the record, the story is better than the movie. And I know that, people who really love horror classics, and especially like horror classic movies, will scoff at that because Hitchcock's The Birds is a classic for a reason, but the story itself, it's so sinister. I think the way the birds attack, because it's much more in the movie is so chaotic. And there are terrifying moments in that movie, but it feels in the story much more calculated. So there seems to be an intelligence behind what they're doing, the birds themselves, and a calculated attack, which again feels very, I think, sinister. I keep using that word, but I can't think of another word right now to describe it. But then there's also the true idea of what I think is so terrifying about Trapped horror is that there's no escape. And at some point, you realize that you've lost. That at some point, you realize, okay, I'm not going to be rescued from this. I'm not going to escape this. There's going to be no after this. This is it. And in the story, The Birds, there is definitely that feeling because the characters do go into a house and they try to, as you said, you kind of use the word bunker. They try to do everything they can to prevent the birds from coming in. So they're kind of gathering in the center of the house. They're trying to board up any doors, any windows. They realize that the birds are going to come through like the chimney itself. So they're trying, it's just and then at some point they realize that the birds have figured out a way to get around even that. So it's not even the idea that they become physically trapped in their house, but that the birds are smart enough and calculating enough to find workarounds to even get inside the house, because these birds are, they're not just like attacking, they're um relentless in the story. It is terrifying. And there's definitely the sense, I think, in the movie, if I remember, it's been a while. I mean, I've watched it a few times, but it's been a while since my last rewatch of it. Even though you kind of know that it's happening other places, or there's a sense that it's happening other places, I feel like that there's a little bit of a hope that it's going to be okay. And in the story, that is completely annihilated. You know, it's it's not going to end well. So yeah, I will say to our listeners, if you've not read the Namaye story, it's a short one, but she does not waste a single word in that story, and it's so good. So absolutely go read Daphne du Maurier's The Birds. It's an excellent example, I think, of early trapped horror, especially this like trapped by nature, um, which it is done really well.
I agree that the story comes off better than the movie. I think you're right that the movie is a little chaotic and lacks like a single focus, I guess, if that makes sense, which is fine for the movie. But the story with that focus on the family and the character Nat trying to protect them and being in the home, I think works really well. And yeah, too, like you said, the relentlessness of the birds, I think, is also scary. And the fact that birds are everywhere. Um, so it's not like if you survive hunkering down your home that you can just go somewhere else and not be attacked anymore. That there's definitely an implication in the story that there's not like another place to go and you're hopeful that you'll get help or whatever. Whereas, like you said in the movie, there's a sliver of hope of that.
Well, since we're talking about trapped in nature, Matt mentioned this one at the top of the episode too, but I want to talk about it at least a little bit. And that is the movie 127 Hours, which is also based on a book, based on a true story. Matt, I know you've talked about this one a little bit. So do you kind of want to give us your thoughts on 127 Hours?
That would actually be a little difficult because I have not seen the film. um, I've seen enough, like the previews and everything. And for those of you who don't know what it's about, it's literally a man who gets trapped while he's not mountain climbing, if I recall, but maybe it was mountain climbing. But he gets trapped between two rocks and has to, I believe, cut his own arm off in order to escape because he's by himself. And just like I said with The Descent, I mean, this is the sort of thing that just gives me the willies. Like the idea, I guess, I guess I would not be out doing that sort of thing by myself anyway. So, I mean, I deliberately take steps to avoid putting myself in those sorts of positions where I would end up in that situation. But even still, just like hearing about it, reading about it, watching it, um, is enough for me to go, no, I just can't. And that's part of why I haven't seen the movie to this point yet. It's one of those things that I keep saying, oh, I should watch that. I've heard it's really good. But generally speaking, every time I actually am about to start it, I'm like, I don't know if I'm in the right spot to watch this right now. And so I've kind of shelved it a few times just because of that, because I don't know that I could handle that level of anxiety that it would produce in me. I mean, the idea of being trapped by yourself physically in a situation where you literally have to cut off an appendage in order to escape and survive. I mean, that's terrifying to me. And correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't this based on a true story?
Yeah, this one is based on a true story. It there's a I said it was based on a book. It's based on specifically a memoir that the real guy wrote about his experience. I think his name was Aaron Ralston. And now I'm remembering that since we're talking about it, Matt, that you you were the reason I watched this movie, because I think maybe you had started it or had seen parts of it, and then you told me that how scary it was, and I was like, "Ooh, I must watch it," and then immediately went and watched it. And I want to say I read the memoir too, but I can't honestly remember if I did or not. But yeah, it is. It's based on a real story that this guy who frequently went out, like he was a rock climber. He was really into hiking, into rappelling, and he was in a canyon in Utah when he um, I think he was hanging off like a boulder that came loose and fell, and he got trapped there with his arm and did have to amputate it using a basically like a pocket knife, if I remember right. This is not considered horror, I don't think. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's considered like a drama. um it was nominated for, I think, quite a few Academy Awards, the movie, when it came out. Really well done, but really horrific to watch. And I will say that if it matters to people, the main character, Aaron, like, he's fine. He survived it. Like, it was like he has triumphed over all of this. But as far as like talking about trapped horror and going out into nature and everything that can go wrong, then this is exactly that. I think it's a really good example, but it is really horrific to watch it happening on the screen, especially knowing that it was a true story and kind of thinking, like, what would you do in that situation? Um, so yeah, you have to be in absolutely the right headspace to watch it. I don't watch a whole lot of true horror. I don't watch a lot of true stories. I'm not into like true crime. Not that this is that, but there's a reason I don't. I think because when it gets too real, it really kind of messes with my brain in a way I don't enjoy. So that's why I appreciate movies that have more of a supernatural twist to them, or when I know that it's something completely made up, even if it's something that could happen. I enjoy it a lot more when I know it is fiction and not reality. But it felt like one of those things that I thought, we really can't talk about being trapped in nature without talking about 127 hours. So yeah, I wanted to throw that out there. But yeah, just know that it is a true story. And I don't know, maybe it's easier to read about for some of you. So if you want to read his memoir, I want to say it's called Between a Rock and a Hard Place, if that kind of shows his personality a little bit. But yeah, I mean, the movie is really well done, but it's harrowing to watch. So yeah. Well, to change it into something that is like completely uh, fictional and kind of get away from the uncomfortable true story. We had mentioned this one a few times, but that's the movie Frozen, not the Disney movie, but the one about the friends who go up on the ski lift and get stuck. That is absolutely kind of stuck in nature and seeing the horrific things that can happen. Um, Matt, Mel, I don't know if any of you have seen that one, but Frozen, I think, is a really great example, and it's another one I don't hear a whole lot of people talking about.
This is the one where they get kind of the double whammy of nature, right? Where they're trapped on a ski lift, and so they're facing the cold and the frostbite, but also possibly wolves if they get out. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I've been really trying to get Mel to watch this movie, so yeah, I'm not going to give too much away. It came out in 2010. It was written and directed by Adam Green, who did the Hatchet movies. I don't know if any of our listeners have seen those are kind of fun to watch. But this one, again, it's not a perfect movie, okay? It's not at the top of any of my lists, but it's a fun movie. And I think it kind of plays with nature in a really fun way. So yeah, you have three friends, two guys and a girl, and at this ski resort, and they're supposed to leave the next day. And so they want to get one last run down the mountain. And too, because bad weather is coming in, and so they basically convince the ski lift operator to let them go up again. But something happens. I can't really remember. It's been a while, but maybe the operator leaves or is replaced by another. I don't know. Anyway, basically everybody forgets that they're up there. They think everybody has already gone down the mountain. So through kind of miscommunication, the chairlift gets shut down and they are just dangling. I mean, they are just sitting in this chairlift dangling. This touches on a lot of fears of mine. I'm not crazy about heights. I don't love chairlifts because it just seems insane to me that you would just dangle from a cord high up in the air with like nothing holding you in. I mean, there's like a bar, but what's that bar gonna do? Absolutely nothing. um so yeah, it's kind of my own personal nightmare. I will kind of let you know that. But basically, yeah, they're hoping that people will come and help them, but like hours and hours pass and they realize that they're not gonna be rescued. And they've got the snowstorm coming through. So you're right, Mel, they've got like the cold and frostbite. That's a very real threat. And then they realize that like there are animals down at the bottom, so even if they could jump, which I think maybe one of them tries, or even if they could try to get down, there are like wolves that are circling underneath. So there's nothing supernatural about this one. This is, I think, pretty well done for like a low budget film, because really it takes place just all on this chairlift. It's very similar, which is another film that we had mentioned, is Open Water, but which just takes place with people kind of floating out in the ocean after they've been accidentally left behind, divers in this case. But it's one of these things where you have only a very small cast that are there for the entire movie. You pretty much have one location, and it's just kind of exploring all the places, like all the things in the natural world that could get us. So yeah, it's one that I would suggest to people if you haven't watched it. But yeah, I kind of get a kick out of the fact that it's called Frozen. just because of the Disney movie, knowing that there's this kind of horrific horror movie that's called that. But I couldn't tell you the ending. I've forgotten that, so I couldn't spoil it if I wanted to. I can't tell you if they get out or not. But I do remember enjoying it. I remember being scared. But yeah, I'm getting cold talking about this movie now, actually. So maybe we should move on to something something different.
Well, Lisa, you mentioned Open Water. Have you seen that movie?
I remember seeing it when it came out.
It's very depressing.
It is. I know. Well, I don't know. Maybe
It's based on a true
spawned-
story.
It is.
Yeah.
This is another one of those that's based on it's kind of a survival film. Although, unlike 127 Hours, this one was marketed as a horror film, even though it was based on, or I think we should say loosely based on, the true story about a group of divers who were left behind after their boat leaves them after some miscommunication. So very similar, I think, to the idea of Frozen, but in this case, floating out in the water. Mel, you've seen this film, haven't you?
I have. And at first, when you threw it out there for Trapped, I wasn't against doing it for Trapped, but my mind was kind of like, oh, if you're in the open water of the ocean, you're not like in a box or a room or a house or stuck on a ski lift. But they are trapped. I mean, especially if you watch it, you kind of see it because at one point the woman says, I'm scared to know what's below me, but I also feel like I need to know what's below me or something to that effect, and it just totally cued all my existential dread of the ocean. It was very disturbing to me, this idea of like not just the miscommunication of leaving them behind, but the idea of them being lost, which we've talked about already, not knowing where they are, not being able to go of their own volition to anywhere that would be safe. And then, yeah, the idea of floating out into the open ocean and having no idea what's around them or below them until it comes close enough that they can see it. They may not be trapped per se with boundaries around them, but they are trapped in that there's no way they're ever going to get out of the situation. And because it's based on a true story and because of the end, which is extremely disturbing, speculating what could have happened to these people, when I got to the end of it, I just felt very bleak and like wrung out because of the anxiety that it produced. But at the same time, I think they did it's well done in showing what could happen in this kind of situation and the choices. I think there's two things there. One is their realization that they're lost and never going to get back, as you mentioned earlier, Lisa, and the other is the realization of their lack of choices or the choices that they're going to have to make. I mean, nobody saws a body part off of their own volition, but they definitely have to start thinking of things in a different way. And I think it also showed too the idea of going out. They're like certified scuba divers. This is nothing to them. They thought that this is a vacation to help them reconnect with each other, so everything is normal, mundane, and then all of a sudden one mistake happens that basically, kind of it destroys our lives. And I think it also brings in that, like, how could this have happened? Like, you do one thing and it becomes this existential struggle, which is a very, very dark, situation to find yourself in. And I think they showed that really well with like the emotions of the divers. But yeah, I think when you were talking about 127 hours, there's, even though there's not the having to injure yourself to get out of the situation, which is harrowing, and I'm not sure if I could watch that. In open water, it's got its own harrowing, anxiety producing moments as you see these people kind of come to grips with what's happening to them and slowly kind of losing hope, which I think is also part of that idea of feeling trapped and not having anywhere you can go.
Yeah, I honestly don't even know how much I can talk about this film because I've mentioned it before on the podcast, but I have that same kind of existential dread bordering on existential panic of open ocean and deep space. The idea of what's behind you or what's around you, what's beneath you. And the fact that when you're out in parts of the ocean and you can think about how, I don't know, just what is happening underneath you and not being able to see it too, is something that's really terrifying. So yeah, it's an intense movie, but I think it does work well for this Trapped. And I think it shows you how Trapped doesn't, because we talked about this again a few episodes ago about how Trapped and claustrophobia are not the same thing. That it does not have to be a closed door situation, a locked door situation. It doesn't have to be a close quarters, where you're trapped physically in that way, because in this case you are trapped. There's no escape, and there's no escaping the dangers that are around you. I think that's something that is a good thing to point out. And honestly, it might be a good thing for us to end this season on. There were a few more that we had talked about wanting to mention, so I'll just give them honorable mentions. The Shining is a great example of trapped. That now that's got supernatural elements, of course, too. But you've got the wintry weather trapping them, where they help cannot get in and they cannot get out. So there's that aspect. And then the movie and the book too by Scott Smith, The Ruins, which takes place in like a jungle type uh, scenario in Mexico, I believe, but where these tourists go hiking and find they want to see some ancient ruins, and they find one that has a plant that is out to kill, as nature sometimes does, and they find that once they've stepped foot onto this particular ruin that they're not getting off again. um, and there are some really fun things that unfold. So again, if you haven't read the book or seen that movie, I highly recommend The Ruins. I recommend the book. The movie's fine, it's a good adaptation, but book itself was just so wonderful. So just kind of want to throw that one out there. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can be trapped by nature. So those are a few of our favorites. We would love to hear some of yours. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. So if you have some recommendations for us of some of your favorite trapped horror, then please share it with us. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon or simply rate and review us, which is entirely free, but it does help other listeners find us. Theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini. We will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.